Our account of the Ascension comes from two texts by the same author, the Gospel of Luke and Acts. It's the last thing that happens in Luke, and it's the first thing that happens in Acts. And we heard both of those texts this morning, but in reverse order. In Luke, it says that he led them out as far as Bethany, lifted up his hands in blessing, and with his hands still raised in blessing, he withdrew from them. Some early copies of the Bible add here, and was carried up into heaven, but the earliest manuscripts just leave it at that. He withdrew from them. So if we hadn't had Acts, we might have imagined that Christ just faded away rather than rising up. But we do have Acts, and Acts recaps the story that ends Luke. And in Acts, it clearly says that he rose up into the sky. Acts picks up on the Gospel of Luke like, now where were we? Yes, Jesus had come back and spent 40 days with the disciples. And at the end of the 40 days, they were together and they asked him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom of Israel? Now, he'd been speaking of the kingdom of God during the 40 days, so that's presumably why the disciples think that the risen Christ is going to claim the throne of David and restore the Israelite monarchy. But Jesus answers them that it's not for them to know the times of the Father, and that they would receive power when the Holy Spirit descended upon them, and that they shall be witnesses not only in Jerusalem, but to the ends of the earth. And having said these things, he bodily rose up into the sky until a cloud took him from their sight. And then two men appeared and addressed the disciples. Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into the sky? This Jesus, who is taken up from you into the sky, will come in the same way as you saw him go into the sky. Now, Tintoretto, in his painting of the Ascension, has stuck very faithfully to this Acts account. And this actually makes the painting quite unique. This is actually not what typical paintings of the Ascension look like at all. But it is an interesting place to start because this is what they would look like if they sought to be just straightforward visual renderings of the Luke Acts account. Tintoretto even includes the evangelist Luke in the lower left foreground, acting as rapporteur of what's occurring behind him. Christ is being received into the cloud and is hidden from the eyes of the disciples who are on the lower right. And it's hard to be certain, but I think that Luke is looking at the disciples rather than at Christ. That is, he is observing the thing that he will report on in Acts, what the disciples experienced at the Ascension. The two men in the center are presumably those who address the disciples, men of Galilee, why do you look up to the sky? Briefly, a word about sky and heaven. I've been using the word sky so far instead of heaven. This is because in biblical Greek there's no distinction between heaven and sky. Uranos just means sky. And it used to be, in the English language, that heaven also just meant sky. It happens to be that in the English language, over the centuries, we've sort of carved off the word heaven to mean the heavens, but not like the atmosphere, heavens in a kind of religious sense. So the words heaven and sky hit the ear quite differently. We say in the Creed, he ascended into heaven, and it would seem quite odd to say he went up into the sky. But that's actually what Acts says, and that's what the Creed says, and that's how the Creed hits the ear in other languages. Il est monté aux cieux, ascendet in caelum, aufgefahren in den Himmel. That is, he went up into the sky. I don't know if that sounds as odd to you as it does to me. He went up into the sky. I keep repeating it because I have an ascension problem, and I don't think I'm alone in that fact. The ascension seems somehow even more unbelievable than the more run-of-the-mill miracles of Christ. And I think that one way that we try to somehow evade the problem is to tell ourselves, well, it's not like he just went up into the sky, he ascended into heaven. And that's the problem. What I'm telling you is that ascended into heaven means went up into the sky. This early 16th century painting by Garofalo illustrates my ascension problem. Jesus is pointing where he's going. Up, up he goes. Up, up and away. Karl Barth, in addressing the ascension problem, writes, "There is no sense in trying to visualize the ascension as a literal event, like a going up in a balloon. The achievements of Christian art in this field are amongst its worst perpetrations. But of course, this is no reason why they should be used to make the whole thing ridiculous. The point of the story is not that when Jesus left the disciples, he visibly embarked upon a wonderful journey into space, but that when he left them, he entered the side of the created world which was provisionally inaccessible and incomprehensible. That before their eyes, he ceased to be before their eyes." Now, I hear what you're thinking, Graham. Just now, you told me that in the Bible, in the creeds, and specifically in the German language, it's clear that Jesus rose into the sky. And then you quoted Barth saying the exact opposite thing, that the ascension doesn't mean that Jesus went up, 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 but rather that he withdrew to the other side of the created order. Which is it? Well, it's both, and this is what's tricky about the doctrine of the ascension. It's absolutely clear that according to Acts, what the disciples saw was Jesus bodily rising into the air until he was received by a cloud. And what Barth is saying is that this bodily rising should not be taken as the route that Jesus takes from here to there. He doesn't get to the place of the Father by going up. It is rather a visual sign given to the disciples to signal his withdrawal from here to there. What Barth is ruling out is the possibility of taking the ascension in such a naive sense as to think that if only the disciples had had a rocket ship, they could have followed where he was going. No, where he is going, they cannot follow, with or without a rocket ship. He's not a rocket man. He's broken on through to the other side. He has gone to an altogether different kind of place. But the visual sign of this withdrawal is what the disciples saw. That's what the creeds say. The creed doesn't say he withdrew to the other side of the created order. What the creed says is what the disciples saw. He went up into the sky. That's the problem. Even if we have a sophisticated metaphysical account of the withdrawal, the whole Christian tradition refers to this withdrawal by its sign, an ascension into heaven. And this is why Barth, I don't often part from Barth, but I think that he's actually wrong here. I think we have to visualize it as a literal event, that's the only grasp we have on it. And I also think that he's wrong about the Christian art. Actually, I'm not sure which art he has in mind, but it seems to me that his worry is that the art reinforces the naive rocket man understanding of ascension. And I think that the Christian art actually does the exact opposite. It's been pretty widely asserted over the past century or so that early Christians must have believed in the naive rocket man version of the ascension. That it was surely only in the wake of the Copernican revolution that Christians generally shifted from the naive view to the more metaphysically sophisticated option of withdrawal to the other side of the created order. Both historians and theologians regularly make this claim, and they seem to think that it's just so self-evident as to not require much argumentation or proof. I think that they're wrong. I think that it's also extremely difficult to actually demonstrate that they're wrong, to demonstrate from the texts that the early church did not take the naive view. And the reason it's so difficult to demonstrate that is because the language of the ascension literally means that Jesus rose up into the sky. That's the problem. That is the ascension problem. Now, actually, Barth is not one of those people who assumes that the pre-Copernican tradition was naive. And yet I do take his objection to the art to be that it encourages the naive view and thereby renders the doctrine ridiculous. Well, this morning I want to show you that the Christian artistic tradition does no such thing. Quite the opposite. The artistic tradition goes out of its way to avoid the naive reading. And the reason that I think this point is germane to a sermon on the Ascension is this. I think that our ascension problem, that is, our anxiety about believing in the Ascension as a point of doctrine, is only partially has to do with our questions about the metaphysically sophisticated version, that is the break on through to the other side version. I mean, those questions do exist, like where is Jesus now? I'm not going to try to answer the question where Jesus is now, except to append to it this question. Given that he's the Lord of space and time, and given that modern physics regards space and time as functions of one another on a continuum, could we ask when Jesus is? But I think the greater part of our anxiety about the Ascension is the creeping suspicion that the early church might really have held the naive version, the Rocket Man version. And if that were the case, then might not the metaphysically sophisticated version be just like a futile attempt to update a religion that essentially belongs to a worldview that we cannot share even if we wanted to? That, I think, is the real source of anxiety about the Ascension. That the Ascension just might show us that Christianity simply presupposes an outmoded cosmology, and that we're just living in denial of this fact. Well, I spent the better part of 6 years reading and thinking about Christ's ascension and session at the right hand of the Father. And for my part, I am totally convinced that the early church held the metaphysically sophisticated view of the ascension rather than the naive one. But as I say, it's just very hard to demonstrate it from the texts. So this morning, what I'm wondering out loud with you is whether the artistic tradition might not be a place to go, to show that the Christian tradition as a whole has actually eschewed the naive reading. Well, there are 3 basic types of ascension images, and we're going to go through them in order. I'm going to call the first the orthodox icon type, the second the mountaineer type, and the third the disappearing Christ type. So, type 1. This is the Rabula Gospels, a 6th century Byzantine book made in what's now Syria. This is definitely a picture of the Ascension. It has the gathered disciples down below. The 2 men who are saying, "Men of Galilee," are here depicted as angels flanking the Virgin Mary, who stands front and center. Jesus holds his hand up in blessing, just as it says in Luke 24. But Jesus is not exactly being received into a cloud in this picture. Rather, he stands within a blue oval mandorla, and below his feet are the elements from the vision of God in chapter 1 of Ezekiel. A great flurry of wheels and glowing metal, and the 4 beasts with the heads of an ox, a lion, an eagle, and a man. So here the bottom register conforms to the Luke Acts accounts, but the top register takes its cues from Ezekiel, not from what Luke says the disciples saw. Why mix it up like that? Well, one reason would be precisely to counteract any potential to read the image as a naive going up, up, up to the Father. The blue oval mandorla serves as a kind of visual portal to signal that where he is going, they cannot follow. This carved panel on the doors of the Church of Santa Sabina in Rome is even earlier, from about 400 probably, but I didn't lead with it because there's no consensus on whether it is actually supposed to be an image of the Ascension or not. But I take it to be the ascended Christ. And like with the Rabula Gospels, Mary is front and center. Christ is not just above the disciples, but is separated from them by a round mandorla. And Ezekiel's vision is referenced with the four beasts, the ox, lion, eagle, and man. The fresco at Bowet Monastery in Egypt, which is also very early, but exact dating is difficult, maybe about 500 or so. Again, we have Mary front and center, and this time she's enthroned and she has an infant Jesus on her lap. So this is no straightforward depiction of Acts chapter 1. It's a kind of composite image. But once again, Christ is not just above the disciples, he's separated from them by a round mandorla. And once again, Ezekiel's vision is referenced with the four beasts, the ox, lion, eagle, and man. And we also have the wheels and the glowing metal from Ezekiel's vision. And now we have a new element. Jesus is sitting down, not standing up. He is enthroned. The fresco dome at Hagia Sophia Thessaloniki shows the next step in the development of the Orthodox icon of the Ascension. Christ is seated like he was at Bowet. He is enthroned on a rainbow now, and it's within a round mandorla. One hand is raised in blessing. He is attended by two angels. Below, Mary is front and center, flanked by the angels who address the disciples, "Men of Galilee, why do you look to the sky?" And the elements of Ezekiel's vision are now gone. There are no wheels, no beasts, and no glowing metal. Okay, so now we have arrived at the standard Orthodox iconography of the Ascension. Its composition has remained pretty much unchanged for about the past 1,000 years. Christ is seated, he's enthroned on a rainbow. He has a round mandorla, one hand raised in blessing, attended by two angels, Mary front and center, flanked by the angels who address the disciples, "Men of Galilee, why do you look to the sky?" And here is Andrei Rubliev's version of that standard icon. It follows the standard formula exactly. Fans of Kanye might recognize the topmost part of this icon. So this type of Ascension image, with Christ and a round mandorla, started life in the 5th and 6th centuries with Jesus standing up and with the elements of the Ezekiel vision, and it has morphed over the centuries into a version with an enthroned Christ and without the Ezekiel vision elements. Why this transformation? The answer, I think, although I can't prove, lies with Psalm 24. Psalm 24 was connected with the Ascension from at least the 2nd century. The second half of that psalm reads, "Lift up your heads, you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates, lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is he, this King of glory? The Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory." Psalm 24, maybe even more than Acts 1, was the go-to biblical text for the Ascension in the early church. It's quoted in conjunction with the Ascension by the Apocalypse of Peter, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Didymus, Athanasius, Eusebius, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, among others. I mean, this is just a sampling. Like, in other words, every church father, when they talked about the Ascension, went to Psalm 24 to talk about it. And the way that these fathers employ Psalm 24 is by dwelling on the angelic question. Who is he, this King of glory? The angels, they say, don't recognize their Lord as he returns to heaven. They don't recognize him because he's assumed human flesh. Who is this, they ask? Who is this King of glory? Now, my guess is that Christ is seated. He is enthroned in the Orthodox icon of the Ascension because he's the King of glory, and a king occupies a throne. And my guess is that what the angels are doing in the image, attending him, is asking and marveling, who is he, this King of glory? All right, type 2 is Christ the Mountaineer. This object, the Ridersche Tafel, is truly old, maybe around 400, and probably made in Rome. It's probably the oldest image of the Ascension that survives. And it must be said, it differs from the Acts account even more than the version where Christ is hovering in around Mandorla. Here, Christ is a mountaineer, and a hand reaches down from heaven to receive him. This really has nothing at all to do with the Luke Acts accounts. So, where did it come from? Well, there are some pagan antecedents, but they're not very satisfactory. Basically, it's a bit of a mystery. My own view is that, like the first type, this second type also primarily depicts Psalm 24, particularly verse 3. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? In other words, I think that this too is a picture of the ascension of Christ as the return of the King of glory. Now we skip forward 4.5 centuries. Here in the Drogo Sacramentary, French, from about 850, Jesus is statelier than he was in the Ridersche Tafel, and there's a better sense of diagonal upward movement toward the receiving hand of the Father. The disciples are gathered below with Mary front and center, and the two angels are there to address the disciples, men of Galilee. If Barth's concern is that the pictures of the Ascension reinforce the naive view, it seems to me that the mountaineer Christ is not at all naive. Does anyone seriously think that the ancient Christians thought that Jesus mountaineered his way to the Father? Or that the Father has a human hand to stick out to receive him? Clearly not. The picture is thoroughly metaphorical. In fact, Barth ought to love it. It precisely doesn't show him going up like a balloon. It shows a withdrawal from here to that other side where he is with the Father. In the Codex Egberti, German from about 990, we see the next stage in the mountaineering Christ. He's no longer on a mountain, but he's still shown in profile. Now he's climbing the air, and the hand of the Father extends down to receive him. And now he appears within a mandorla. Giotto painted the Ascension in two different churches. In one, Christ is surrounded by a golden mandorla, and in the other, there is no mandorla. But the place to which he's ascending is differentiated from the rest of the sky with 3 concentric aureoles. Both pictures are clearly a development of the mountaineer ascension. Christ is shown in profile, and he's climbing the cloud like it was a mountaintop. There are severe losses to the fresco in one of the images, but both of them originally showed 2 angels pointing up and addressing the assembled disciples, men of Galilee. And this brings us back to Tintoretto, whose Christ belongs firmly to the mountaineering type, shown in profile, boldly climbing upward on a diagonal, arm outstretched upward toward his goal. In every other respect, Tintoretto is attentive to the Luke Acts account. But according to Luke, Christ's hands were raised in blessing as he withdrew. But here, Christ is not blessing the disciples. He's reaching up toward the hand of the Father, which is no longer shown, but is still implied. Okay, this brings us to the third basic type of ascension image, and that is that of the disappearing Christ. It was developed by English manuscript illuminators in the 11th century, and this is a typical example in the Tiberias Psalter. And this type of image spread throughout Western Europe over the next few centuries, and then it largely fell out of favor after the 15th century. So now here's a disappearing Christ as an enamel panel, part of a monumental altarpiece at the Kloster Neuburg Monastery outside of Vienna, executed by Nicholas of Verdun in 1180. The composition, with the disciples tightly clustered together, and the use of foreshortening to give a vertiginous feeling to the whole thing, makes it feel kind of realistic, like actually almost imaginable. And, maybe this is the kind of image that Barth is worrying about. This is a German painting from about 1513 by Hansius von Kulmbach. So, why was the most naive version the last to develop? For one thing, because it presupposes the whole history of types 1 and 2. It is the most realistic of the three types in that this actually is an imaginable approximation of what it maybe looked like to the disciples. There are no mandorlas, there are no angels, there's no hand of the Father descending from the sky. There's just Christ going upward and disappearing into a cloud. It sticks to the text of Acts. And almost certainly, it should be read as an attempt to replace the older mountaineering type with an image more faithful to what Acts says the disciples saw. So yes, in this sense, it is more naive than the earlier two types, both of which opted for the Psalm 24 imagery, at least in my opinion, over the Acts account. It seems to me that the earlier reticence to just show realistically what Acts describes is precisely a function of worry about an overly naive reading of such images. It was only after 1,000 years of reciting the Creed that the church felt ready to depict the Ascension as it's actually described, confident that the viewing audience would understand that this doesn't mean that Jesus just kept going up, up, up in the same direction until he arrived at his destination. In any case, the emphasis on feet in the disappearing Christ type has a consequence that attention is drawn to the nail holes in them. Christian Worthington's painting of the Ascension in his Credo series belongs, of course, to this third type, the disappearing Christ. And I didn't have a chance to consult the artist because I wrote this late last night. I don't know what he makes of my interpretation. But to my mind, this image poses the angelic question. Who is he, this King of glory? And it gives the ringing answer. It is he whose feet were pierced, for they crucified the Lord of glory. I've been trying to show that for the whole first millennium of church history, the artistic tradition assiduously avoided any iconography of the Ascension that might encourage the naive reading that Christ just kept going up until he arrived at the Father. They used mandorlas and aureoles and the Father's hand coming down from heaven to signal that he was moving to a different kind of place, somewhere that we provisionally but truly cannot follow. But I've also been trying to suggest, I don't really have firm evidence, but it's my hunch that the Ascension iconography of at least types 1 and 2 are based more on Psalm 24 than on the Luke Acts accounts. And why does this matter to me so much? Well, in part, because I think that we're much too liable to think of the Ascension in terms of Christ's absence. But the angels in Psalm 24 aren't saying, open the doors to let him out. They're acclaiming, open the doors to let him in. It's about arrival and presence, much more than it's about departure or absence. This is why the angels address the disciples, "Men of Galilee, why do you look to the sky?" The Ascension is fundamentally about Christ's going to the Father. Henceforth, to speak of divine presence is never to speak of some kind of neutral providence or omnipresence. To speak of acts of God or the hand of God can never presuppose that God might act with mercy or might act with vengeance. The omnipotence of God is not wielded by some unknown monarch behind the veil. No, God has feet, and those feet have holes in them. This is the King of glory. The immensity of God, that is his immeasurability, his omnipresence, and his providence are not neutral. They're not pre-Trinitarian, and they're not pre-Christological. They are rather from the Father of this incarnate, pierced King of glory. And they are mediated through this incarnate, pierced King of glory. And they are manifest in the Spirit of this Father and this King of glory. God's presence in and with his creatures is never other than this presence, the presence of the triune God, who in his second person is the man Jesus Christ. Hence the connection between Ascension and Pentecost. Why Christ needed to leave before he sent the Spirit. It's not because only one person of the Trinity can be present in the world at any given time. It's that Pentecost names the presence in the Spirit of God with this modification. Not just Father and Son, but Father and incarnate, crucified, and risen Son. The Father and his Son, the King of glory, and their Spirit. Who is this King of glory? He is the one who has already undergone the judgment on our behalf, has borne it upon his person, and has risen victorious, and lives and reigns with the Father and the Spirit.